as we noted, construction itself is about 23% complete. So we expect to get a lot of work done this construction season, and we have the 2 remaining ones. Double track is really moving along. The overall construction is 54% complete, but I think by the construction season around November, we'll be up in the high, probably at the 90% mark. Most of the work has been done east of Dune Park. Some small work to be done in the city, some cul-de-sacs and some pavers to be put in, but nothing major there. And then to the west of Dune Park is really where you'll see the same work as last year, rail lines being laid, the double tracking, as well as a number of bridges there. Some of the other projects, the DT2, which is actually the 11th Street station, while the station itself is, the platforms are pretty much set there, the design of the garage is complete, and they've gone out for procurement on the precast elements, which I think are now being fabricated, and they're also gone out for a contract on some of the preliminary earthwork there. At the Gary Miller station, quite a bit of work there. The building itself is up, the roof, it's been dried in. They're actually installing drywall. The roof has its preliminary part on it, and I think they're actually putting, if they haven't already, put the metal roof on top. So we're in good position there. Most of the work is supposed to be done by the end of this construction season. So lots to see out there. I think you'll be by this time next year. Hopefully you'll be riding the double track. So that's the update on construction.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yeah, AJ, I've got a question and then a comment.
Please.
Okay. On the 11th Street station, are the architectural designs available to be seen by us, or at least by me?
I'll have to check on that. What I know is the design of the garage itself, and that can be shared. I don't know where they are actually in terms of I think you're talking more about the tower for the mixed use, correct?
Well, to be honest, I don't know a whole lot about the design, but we're still working through our design issues on our potential future downtown station, and I just would be curious to know what Michigan City is doing, and compare, contrast, whatever.
No problem. And you're looking for more of the architectural, just the kind of what I call the elevation view and things like that, not necessarily the floor plans of every floor.
Correct, the elevations.
Okay. I will. I'll get with Skylar and see if we can get that.
Right. The comment I have, this is just more an observation by driving our streets, where pretty much between 165th Street up towards Waltham, where the tracks are being laid as they come to the street crossings. And this is just me driving it, but I'm just really questioning whether or not the rail and the rail line itself, where it's being constructed, that looks like it's going to be below the grade of the street. So I just thought someone might want to look at their construction plans as well as their construction activity to make sure that the train track is in the right place.
Okay, the elevation wise, yeah. I'll get with Nick D and Mike Rowe or Nicole on that, and have them take another look at that. But you said between 165th and Waltham, the track. Yeah,
that's where I've noticed it most. I don't necessarily drive every intersection, but that's where I typically drive.
Okay, yeah, I can ask them. I apologize. I mean, I'm not with Nick D or on the construction directly, so but I will.
No, and that's fine. I guess I don't know who the appropriate person is to get
No, I'll pass it along to the appropriate person and get you a response. No problem. That's no problem.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please. John Blackburn from Beverly Shores. There's a bullet point under a double track that the construction substantially completion projected for January 17th. Is that fairly reasonable, or is it really looking at spring?
Well, that's what they call substantial completion, and then there's several months of testing for the spring to start of revenue service. but it's still, we're still looking at January 17th for what they call substantial completion. Substantial completion means things are largely done, but then you still have the punch list items. So as far as the last update that NICD provided to us and to the funding partners as well as the FTA was they were still on schedule. So
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Vince. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, the TDD Boundaries update, and I believe Aaron Kowalski with MKSK will be presenting.
Thanks, AJ. All right, so I'm going to give an update on kind of the next round of boundaries, as well as boundaries that have been established. So Dave Wellman, if you could advance the slide, we'll keep moving. Thank you. So update on boundaries. So we've, as you all know, established boundaries for, the majority of the communities impacted by the rail and enabled by legislation. As we're getting into spring and summer, the RDA is continuing to provide what we call TDD and TOD technical assistance, especially when potential development comes to the table. We've been working with several communities in that regard. We're also going to be setting up meetings with the local units on review of the MOAs, developer process guide, and that increment will begin to be collected in 24 for calendar year 23. Next slide, please. And then we have a number of communities we're working with already, and there's a potential for some additional communities on this next round of boundaries. So just to remind folks, I know a lot of you have been through this process, but we'll be going through the same exact process to establish a second boundary in Hammond, focused on the Hammond South Station. We're working closely with the city of Gary and have been for several months, but we're kind of kickstarting that boundary process now that we've completed the TOD planning for the downtown area. And then we're also working and looking at the Dune Park area. Other communities that are eligible, there's new legislation that allows for the creation of a transit development district in Valparaiso that services their bus. So we will likely be talking with City of Valpo in the coming months. Beverly Shores is eligible. So John, I know you're on the call. If your council, feels that you're at a point where you'd like us to explore that boundary, we're happy to do so. And then South Bend's also on the list. And I think as most of you know, there's some work being done to determine the exact location of the station at the airport campus. It's likely to slide to allow for better service. So all of that being said, as we're getting into spring and summer, we're all very familiar with these areas. We've done a lot of due diligence already. In some cases, we've done TOD planning. And so this will allow us to kind of really get into what I would call streamlined transit development district process for these communities. In June, we're working to schedule meetings with the local units and really beginning to have those in-depth conversations about the boundaries, what should be captured in the boundaries based on our analysis, as well as the analysis of the RDA's consultants, policy analytics, and KPMG. Then as we get into the summer months, we'll be working to draft those boundaries with the goal of then satisfying the requirements in statute, as well as public engagement this summer. And then as we get into early fall, we would conduct any remaining engagement, craft those final boundaries, seek local letters of support from the local units, and then conduct the first and second RDA public hearings as specified by statute, and then take the boundaries with all of those steps completed to the state budget committee to have them establish a second round of boundaries. So that would happen in the fall. Those would be established in then at that point. So happy to answer any questions folks might have in that regard, but that is the process. Next slide, please. And then just a little bit more detail on the process, what goes into it. As I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit more of a streamlined process this time around. But really, we're focused on drafting the boundary, collaborating with NICD. And then as we are drafting that boundary, we take both the TOD planning that's been completed, at least for some of the communities, and then combine that with additional market analysis, infrastructure analysis, and mapping. And then that allows us to get at a draft boundary that then could be revised, shared out, and that we can collect that public input. Next slide, please. The next update I have is on TOD Implementation Planning. So this is the update on the TOD planning project that's been occurring over the past year and a half that was funded through a grant from the FTA pilot program and in collaboration with local units, NICD, and RDA. So this is a slide that kind of compares, the TDD planning and TOD planning and shows how they work together. So we have, as the first phase, which was creating the boundaries, and then the follow-on project is really development readiness planning. And so what we've done over the past year and a half is met with the local units and really done deep dive studies in many of these communities, focused on really giving the communities tools for local consideration and adoption. Local units maintain land use and zoning control, of course, but then also really try to help understand the art of the possible regarding development and TOD development in these areas, as well as enabling components. So the kind of this snapshot is kind of an update on where we are with each of the communities, and then also kind of a synopsis of the process that we've gone through. Next slide, please. So where we are today, so we've completed TOD plans for the bulk of the communities in this area that are impacted by the rail projects and can have the TDD boundaries. So Hammond, East Chicago, Gary, Hugh and Gary, Portage, Ogden Dunes, Michigan City, and then Munster and Dyer. So those reports have been completed and they're under review by local units. We're making edits based on feedback from local units. And then we are preparing several TOD readiness reports. We completed those internally. Those are for several of the communities that could have some degree of TOD, but maybe not for various factors as much TOD as the ones on the left. So, and it looks like there is a question in the chat. Let's see if I can see this. One sec. Dave Wellman, can you read the question?
I don't have a question. I have a note from Tim Corcoran, I think, as South Bend. So
sorry, I didn't want to. Hey, sorry guys, I didn't want to interrupt your flow, Aaron, and I accidentally hit enter. But I was just curious if at some point maybe you could share one of the more completed reports, just so that we could, just to get a sense of like what's all involved in that.
Absolutely, yeah, we can do that. And actually, the next couple slides will kind of give you guys a snapshot of that too. So next slide, please. So the TOD implementation planning. So there's a first section that's an introduction, an explanation of transit-oriented development, and then kind of a regional strategy for why transit-oriented development is important in Northwest Indiana and some of the opportunities from a regional scale. And all of this work is also in support of the TOD planning that NERC has done as well. I know that came out last year. So we've kind of cross-referenced those plans as we put this together. Next slide, please. So for each of the communities, we did a planning needs and gaps analysis that built upon the work that we did during the Transit Development District study. We did a deep dive on land use and zoning and provided pretty detailed recommendations for future land use, how land use could change over time as development occurs, and then an analysis of existing zoning, as well as a coding template that the local units that could then take, review, and adopt to be able to have TOD zoning in place. We've done infrastructure, environmental, and transportation assessments focused on understanding any barriers to development within these TOD areas, as well as other opportunities for improvement. As part of that, we also did the deep dive on several corridors that were high profile for the local units that were in the kind of the TOD sheds. I mentioned development opportunities. We did a deep dive in each of these communities on development, and then put together a capital projects plan to help them to understand what infrastructure improvements could potentially cost from an order of magnitude perspective. Next slide, please. So you'll see snippets from several different plans. As I mentioned, these are under review by the local units. But the goal was to create kind of a 60-page plan that encapsulates for each of the communities, that encapsulates this process, as well as the results and recommendations. As we get into the TOD strategy, we built each of these unique to the communities, but in general, they followed the same framework, which was an overview, land use planning, development planning, infrastructure, zoning, and implementation. And the implementation steps were written in such a way that the local units could then take and work to achieve these steps on their own. And we captured a lot of that feedback through this process. Next slide, please. As part of that, also, we developed an evaluation criteria. Each community was at a different place, is at a different place from a TOD readiness perspective. So we captured that. We also captured community priorities based on multiple meetings with mostly staff, as well as some elected officials from the local units. And so we developed the plan around those community priorities, and we looked at different components based on that as well. Next slide, please. Big moves were kind of the enabling steps that could signal to the market that conditions are right for TOD to occur. This example here is Gary in the downtown area, but what we've done is created for each of these communities a unique and custom approach towards what we feel the big bold moves could be to allow for TOD development to occur in each of these areas. Next slide, please. We've also looked at TOD opportunities from a site perspective. We did a deep dive on ownership, on ability for potential redevelopment, market forces, market interest, developer interest today, to then put together a plan for where we think TOD development could occur in the future, and other areas that could see significant economic development, where be it buildings, being revitalized and invested in, and or filling in parking lots, and looking at ways for investment in that regard. Next slide, please. As part of this study, we developed a number of TOD types that we then applied to each of the areas. And so these are two examples of downtown TOD, which, if you think about downtown Michigan City, downtown Hammond, downtown Gary, that really fits that TOD type. We have several other TOD types. The other example here is a village TOD. It's a little bit smaller in scale. It might be something appropriate in Munster, or for instance, in Portage, or in the Miller area, East Chicago. So we developed these different kinds of TOD, as well as explanations of the character, as well as how development occurs in these. And then that supplements recommendations for future land use. And where we made recommendations for land use, the goal is that the local units could take that as they update their individual comprehensive plans in the future and integrate some of this data. We did not call out areas from from a land use perspective that we did not anticipate changes in. Next slide, please. And then as we think about TOD types, we also called out what we call arc of development. So how development could potentially occur in a 5, 10, and 20-year timeline based on opportunities for development, availability of property, and market forces. And then we put together some very high-level impact ranges showing opportunities for growth in development of square footage, as well as extrapolated out that data to show potential for new housing units, as well as population and employee, as well as vehicular trip generation analysis. So none of this is set in stone. Obviously, in each of these communities, TOD could be impacted by a lot of X factors that could cause this 5, 10, and 20-year timeframe to shift. But we wanted to provide kind of an analysis of a range in which this could occur. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Aaron, just as another thought is putting them all next to each other, you know, so you could see like the cumulative effect of all the work, right? Because it's impressive any one station, but when you see it as a whole, you really get to see the broader impact of what this whole project's all about.
I think that's a good idea. And as we get, you know, kind of final comments and sign off from the local units, I think that's something we could definitely put out on the website we've developed here. TOD Development Studies. This example is in Hammond, near the Gateway Station. So looking at opportunities for development on sites near the stations, walkable to the station, thinking about development character, and then working with the local units to understand what kind of development could potentially occur in these areas that is supported by, you know, the community, as well as really helps to express the vision for these areas. Next slide, please. Corridor types. So we can then look into corridors in this area, and this example is Portage, but thinking about how infrastructure could be improved, what type of corridor could be developed in this area from a thoroughfare perspective, how that corridor could link into you know, various trail networks, as well as really help to create an opportunity for TOD development. Next slide, please. And then in some of the communities where there was interest in going a step deeper, we put together what we call conceptual road design. This example is in Michigan City, looking at a two-way conversion of Franklin Street and the potential to allow for better parking, better retail frontage, better access throughout the downtown area in support of TOD, as well as these areas that are critical to the communities. Next slide, please. Then development visioning, you know, we need to be able to see the vision. So we put together for each of these communities a snapshot of what could potentially occur, how development could potentially build out. This example is downtown Gary, looking at a potential for a new station, as well as a redevelopment of some of the blocks around City Hall and the courthouse. Now, this really is, you know, not necessarily an indicator of how exactly development will occur, but we wanted to call out the art of the possible and opportunities as we think about that 20-year potential for the region. So we did this for each of the communities to allow for, you know, the cities and towns to be able to get excited about the potential that is then supported by TOD and the, you know, the rail upgrade. Next slide, please. I mentioned zoning, so we provided each of the communities, and we worked with a zoning partner as part of our team. We provided zoning recommendations for each of the communities. Some of the communities, for instance, Munster, had very new zoning, so we did not provide as much detail, for example, there, but for example, in East Chicago, their zoning is pretty old. So we provided this coding template that was kind of form fit to what we thought TOD zoning could be in these areas, and then could then be taken and reviewed by the local units with the goal that they could extract components from this zoning and take it and adopt it locally, so that they could then have a new code for these TOD areas to enable the development that is envisioned throughout the TOD plan to occur. But again, reinforcing that the local units control land use and zoning. So this is a resource that can allow for the communities to then move forward with that process. Next slide, please. Then we also put together pretty detailed implementation steps for each of the communities, organized in immediate next steps, short-term strategies, long-term strategies, enabling actions, recommendations, and the like. Next slide, please. And I will pass it on, I believe, to David Reynolds. AJ, if that's okay.
That is great. I guess the only thing I would ask those here, did you have any questions of Aaron before we did pass it to Mr. Reynolds? Okay, hearing none. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I dropped the request to Aaron in the chat. If he could pass on that zoning template to the city of Gary, I appreciate it.
Absolutely, I'll send that to you. And I've been working with Wendy and Terrell to set up a meeting in a couple weeks as well. So I can forward you that information as well.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much. Yes, then I'll turn it over to Mr. Reynolds for a legislative update.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess it's still good morning up there, everyone. This was a good session from the standpoint of TDDs in northwest Indiana. There was essentially 3 pieces of legislation that we were watching and to differing degrees actively involved in working the legislation through the process. The first one is House Enrolled Act 1046, and it authorized the RDA to establish a transit development district in Valparaiso. There's an interest in having a district around the new transit center that's currently under construction with the Journeyman Distillery project. And the map kind of shows you potentially where that TDD at least is intended to go. Based on what Aaron was saying, you know, we would treat this just like we did with the other transit development districts and begin the discussions with Valparaiso to work through this. Next slide, Dave, please. Senate Enrolled Act 434 was a very good bill for transit development. I think it goes to show the General Assembly's continued interest in public transit in Northwest Indiana. It provided, Senate Enrolled Act 434 provided state funding for blight elimination within the Gary metro area. It also provided state funding for a new metro multimodal station in downtown Gary, and does require local match to draw down the state dollars. And then the RDA will actually be advancing the funding on the blight elimination beginning this coming July 1 of 2023 for 2 years to get the program moving forward in preparation for the new Gary Metro station. Next slide, Dave. And then House Enrolled Act 1454 is a fairly technical. It was the DLGF, the Department of Local Government, their agency bill. There was some cleanup that we were requesting with the Transit Development District statute. And essentially what the General Assembly agreed to do was to add that the local income tax of residents living within the TDD, that the incremental growth of the residential income will be captured by the TDD. That was, I would say, the intent of the TDD language all along, that it would capture both residential and employment in the district. This language then just clarifies that so that the TDD will be able to capture both. It further clarified in case there was an individual that lived in one TDD and worked in another TDD, how that would be handled. And so the statute now says that it would be based on where the individual lived, if they happen to live in one and work in another. And then this last piece on 1454 permits the sharing of TDD incremental revenues between TDDs, two TDDs that are in the same municipality. So this really applies to Gary and Munster. Those are the three communities that have two TDDs within their municipal boundaries, and with action of the municipal fiscal body, they would be able to share the increment between the two TDDs. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Are there any questions of the members? Hearing none. Mr. Wellman, I believe with Mr. Corcoran joining the meeting that we have a quorum.
Yes, we do.
If I could, then I'd like to go back to an item on the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes of the February 15th, 2023 meeting. I'd entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
Motion to approve.
Second, Mr. Chairman, Trent McCain.
Thank you. There's a motion and second to approve the minutes of the February 15th meeting. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Those opposed, the same sign. Hearing none, the minutes of the February 15th meeting are approved. And I believe then going back to the agenda, the next item is next steps and any other questions that there may be. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, hearing none, it looks like the next meeting of the Transit Development District Steering Committee will be August 16th at 11 a.m.
Great.
With that, go ahead, please.
No, I just said thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. If there is nothing left, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
There's a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? The motion is second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
You do.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.